Hey guys, welcome to Bookish Islander. My name is Juan. I hope you're all doing very well. Today is Friday, so I'm here to do my Friday Reads, which is my weekly catch-up on my reading. And this week, I finished a novel called Late in the Day by English writer Tessa Hadley. If you watch my channel, if you've been watching my channel for a bit now, you would probably know that I can be a bit of an impulse reader. I've been known to pick up a book just because I hear someone talk about it and completely neglect any TBR that I previously planned. So this is what happened with Late in the Day. Last weekend I was listening to a podcast of a Canadian radio show called Writers and Company. If you don't know about that show and you love books and you love writers and you love to hear writers talk about their books, you should check it out. In the program that I was listening to, they were talking to Tessa Hadley and they were talking about her most recent novel, Late in the Day, but also other previous work by her. And then as I was listening to that, I remember reading a review of Late in the Day quite a few months ago, and it kind of put it on my radar, but then I forgot about it. You know, there was something about the way she talked about her novel and the way she talked about the world that made me think that perhaps I would like this novel. So yeah, lo and behold, I got it as an ebook. I read it. I almost devoured it. I read it over, I think, 3 days. And there is a lot about it that I like. I didn't love it. I almost would say that I regret reading it because it kind of took time away from reading other things. You know, there's a book that I'm trying to finish that begins with middle and ends with March. You might have heard me talk about it. In Late in the Day, you have two heterosexual, middle-aged, middle-upper-class English couples. And one of the husbands dies suddenly. That's no spoiler, that happens within the first couple of pages. It's the setup for the book. These two couples are friends. One of the husbands dies. What could possibly go wrong? You know, reading this novel made me think about something that I've often thought and felt before, that queer readers, when we read literature with heterosexual characters, with heterosexual problems, I mean, we're so au fait, we know all the tropes, we know exactly what to expect, you know, all the obsession with infidelity, you know, cheating, oh yeah, her husband cheated on her, oh no, it's the end of the world. You know, we know all of that, we know how men and women, how their friendship goes, you know, all the tropes, all the stereotypes. We know it so well because we've been privy to it and we've been subjected to all of those things on every television show, every movie, and almost every book that we read. And if one were to take a stance and take the viewpoint of the queer reader on it, a lot of it sounds so ridiculous, and it was quite a struggle for me not to find a lot of what this book dealt with. So I'm talking here about the plot and the relationship between the two couples and their children. Everyone is heterosexual here, as ridiculous. Now, that would perhaps be unfair, so I'm gonna leave all of that aside, now that I've mentioned it, but I'm gonna leave it all aside now. And just say that the book has a lot of strengths. It's a book that definitely keeps going, keeps you interested. And I think this is actually the book's merit, despite the banality of a lot of the plot. And when I first started reading it, and the opening scene where, you know, we find out, that one of the husbands is dead, I thought that was masterfully written. It was great, and I thought the book would deal with grief, which is a theme that is very close to my personal experience, and it's a theme that sometimes I have to take a step back from, and sometimes it really appeals to me. It depends on how I'm doing personally at that moment, but you know, I felt like ready to read a good novel about grief. But it isn't about that at all. It's more about infidelities and banal stuff that has been written about to exhaustion, and that I don't find one little bit interesting. Having said that, late in the day, it's a good book. It's very well written. It kept me engaged and interested until the very end. So I would recommend it if you think that, if it sounds like something that you might enjoy. It's worth your time. It won't take a lot of your time. But honestly, I could have passed up on it easily. If you watched last week's Friday reads, I mentioned that I was reading, or that I had started to read John Cheever and his stories, and rereading some of them, reading some of them for the best time. I have the book of stories that he wrote, and I'm just reading a story here and there. I don't mind if it takes me years to finish the book, but my goal is to read every single short story that John Cheever ever wrote and got published. Last week I talked about The Geometry of Love. If you want to know my opinion on that story, go back and watch my previous Friday reads, because I talk about it and my reaction to it. But then on last week's video, I asked you guys to recommend short stories by John Cheever. Quite a few of you actually recommended stories. Everyone who recommended stories either recommended The Swimmer or The Enormous Radio, or both. I'd already read The Swimmer. I, to my recollection, haven't read The Enormous Radio. So what I decided to do when I had time between books this week was to go back and reread The Swimmer. And once again, it's such an experience. You know, I think any reader should read The Swimmer just because of the experience, just because how puzzling it is, just because how sad it is, just because how exhilarating some of it is. It almost feels as you read like you're getting wet and drunk and drunker and wetter, and it's so bizarre, it's so amazing, it's so ultimately sad and ultimately beautiful that I couldn't recommend that story enough. If you've never read The Swimmer by John Cheever, it's a short story, for God's sakes. Drop all your Victober huge novels or your Anthony Trollops and your Charles Dickens and read The Swimmer by John Cheever if you haven't. I'm hoping to get to The Enormous Radio, or An Enormous Radio, can't remember the exact title right now, and I'm too lazy to check it out. You know, I'm meaning to read that very soon, hopefully this week, and I'll let you know how I react to it, which I'm hoping would be positively. I'm also, of course, still reading most of the books that I talked about on my previous Friday reads, you know, including that book that begins with middle and ends with March, and other stuff, so you know, I don't have much to report on that book or the others. But there's another book that I started reading this week that I wanted to talk to you about, which is Soif by Amélie Nothomb. She's a Belgian writer who writes in French. She's hugely popular in France. She publishes a book every September there. And I believe most, if not all of her books have been translated into English. Soif, which is her latest novel, just came out a few weeks ago, back in September, hasn't been translated or hasn't been published in English language translation yet, but I've no doubt it will soon be. The title translates literally as thirst. I don't know if that's the title they will use in English. I hope they do. Although the word thirst has some kind of millennial sexual connotation, but she doesn't mean it in that way. I don't think it has that connotation in French at all. So I don't know, they might change the title. The point is that it's amazing. I'm more than halfway through. I could have finished it, but I was busy reading late in the day and, you know, everything else that I'm currently reading. So I'm taking my time with it, and that's fine. I really love her writing, and it's amazing because she's a really popular writer, but she's also really good, worth reading. Having said that, I haven't read most of her books, and I haven't read most of her books because she publishes one every September. So she publishes a book a year, a novel a year, and she's been doing that since she first started in the early 90s. So she has, I believe, 27 books published right now, so that's a lot. But I've read a few of them, and I would recommend, if you've never heard of her, or if you've heard of her but haven't read anything by her, I would actually recommend, rather than Soif, which I think it's great, but because that's not available in English anyway, I would recommend Fear and Trembling, Stupeur and Tremblement, which I believe is one of her first novels. It's fairly autobiographical. It's about a European girl who goes, well, it's a European girl who was actually born and raised or spent her early childhood or most of her childhood in Japan, much as Amélie Nothomb, the writer, did herself. So this European person goes back to Japan because she feels Japanese and she wants to live there. And then she gets this hilarious and hugely readable culture shock. But going back to her latest novels, Soif, she has done something that a few writers have done in the past, which is to take Jesus Christ, as a literary character and explore his life or moments in his life. Immediately, the novel that springs to mind is The Gospel According to Jesus Christ by José Saramago, which I haven't read yet, but I know that that was quite controversial, extremely controversial in Portugal when it came out. And I know that Soif has invited some kind of mild controversy in France, but France is fairly secular when it comes to Catholicism these days, so, it hardly matters. So she takes Jesus Christ as her main character, and she focuses specifically in the days leading up to his crucifixion. And the novel is written in first person, so what we hear is Jesus's voice, well, mostly actually his thoughts on what's going on, what he's done, and actually the regret he has for a lot of the things he did, which of course Amélie Nothomb takes from the Gospels. So I'm a former Catholic or a lapsed Catholic or someone who was raised mildly as a Catholic but by a family who was really not practicing. So I still have complicated feelings about religion and about Christianity and Catholicism. But, this book does not really... I don't see how it could be offensive. Having said that, because I live in a country where there are still a lot of Catholics, and I have a church just right at the end of my street that is very well attended, even in 2019, so yeah, perhaps some very, what do you call it, very strongly, starkly Catholics would find it offensive. I don't, and I don't see why. I think it could be slightly provocative at that, but it's written in such a fun way that it's actually mostly made me laugh. Just weird because it deals with the crucifixion. But anyway, I'm only halfway through, might get sadder from now on, but there's something about the ironic tone that Nothomb uses to kind of convey Jesus' thoughts that I find incredibly amusing. And another book that I wanted to talk to you about that I'm kind of not, where I'm like, I think 70% in, is The Narrow Road to the Deep North by Richard Flanagan. And I'm reading this book as a part of my Booker Through the Decades project. So in this project, I'm reading all the books that have won the Booker Prize, but I'm doing it by decade. So the one that was on my list to read next, because I'm doing the current decade, was this one, The Narrow Road to the Deep North, which is an Australian novel, and it deals a lot with the European wars of the 20th century, because the main character has to go fight, and not just European wars, actually, also in Asia. Anyway, I'm struggling with parts of it. I don't really have a formed opinion, coherent opinion yet, so I'm gonna wait until I finish to talk to you more about it. But I wanted to mention something about Booker Prize books. There is another booktuber, Run Right Reads, who's also reading novels that won the Booker Prize. But as far as I understand it, she's not doing it in any particular order. She's just reading them as she finds them or as they appeal to her. I'm doing them by decade, but I thought it was fair to say that if you're into the Booker Prize and you want to hear, watch reviews of those novels that have won the prize, you should go check out her channel because she's talked about a lot of them. And because I'm doing it through the decades, it will take me a while to get to the 80s, which I think it's going to be my next decade, or then the noughts or the 70s. You might have a favorite book or a book that you want to hear me talk about, and I might not get to that for months and months. And if you go check out her channel, she might have already talked about it. So go check her out. Also, her channel is great anyway. She talks about, amazing books. Okay, so those are all the books that I've read this week or that I'm reading this week. And now I wanted to talk to you about something completely different. It's a bit of an announcement. If you watch BookTube regularly, if you specifically watch certain booktubers, you might have heard about something called Booktuber Prize. So there's a particular channel that you should check out if you want to know more about this prize, which is Barter Hordes, and I'm gonna link to it in the description box. So go check him out, go check the channel out to find out more about it. The reason I'm talking about it now is that they're already getting ready for next year's prize. This year was the first year that they did it. It felt more like a pilot or an experiment. I think it went really well. I had no part in it, mostly because I started my channel this year when everything was already happening, so I didn't volunteer to do anything with it, or I wasn't part of it at all. There is a call for judges for next year, and if you have a channel where you talk about books and you do that regularly, you qualify as a judge. They need as many judges as they can get. And also, if you don't have a channel, but you're someone who regularly comments, you might still have a chance to be a judge. I don't want to talk more about what it takes to be a judge, what they're asking for, because I don't want to get it wrong. But go check out Barter Horse channel. I'm gonna link not just to the channel, but to the Call for Judges video. So go check it out, because he talks about what he's looking for, what he needs, and there is information in that video on how to become a judge. I've already volunteered to become a judge next year for the second year, and you can do so too. But you know, like I said, you want to find out more, go to my description box, click on the link and find out more, and you know, take it from there. So this is my Friday reads. Let me know what books you've been reading this week. Let me know if you have anything to say about the books that I've mentioned on this video. Other than that, have a great weekend, and I hope to see you again very soon. Bye bye.